Thank you for inviting me to take part in your webinar. My name is Liz Allen, and I guess I'm the author of the original See Think Act material, which is material that we wrote in 2010 about relational security. So my background, when I wrote this, I was head of policy at the Department of Health in England for our secure services, medium security services and low security services here in the UK. Now I mostly work independently, and I do a lot of work around relational security, but also things around forensic care planning as well. So I'm thrilled to join you today. This is the See Think Act material. It's a kind of the yellow book. You're very able to download this relational security guide from our website, which I can signpost you to today, but also from the Royal College of Psychiatry in England website as well. So this is the material that I'm going to talk to you very briefly today. Normally when I talk about relational security, we run here in the UK and abroad facilitator programs for relational security, and I can talk for about 5 days solidly on the subject of relational security. So 20 minutes feels quite short to me, but I'm going to try and give you a very quick overview of the background of where we got to here with the relational security development work, and a little bit of an introduction to the model, and the hope that if you want further information, obviously we can signpost you to that. A little bit about the background. So the first See Think Act book was written in 2010, and I wrote it whilst I was head of policy at the Department of Health. And the reason we wrote it was we had what you might call a cluster of events happening in our medium security hospitals here in the UK. So this is very much about forensic mental health services at this stage. But we had a cluster of events that drew the attention of some of our ministers, so our Secretary of State for Justice and our Secretary of State for Health, who collectively oversaw what we might see kind of mental health and justice. So for those people who are often detained in our mental health services, but also have a detention under the justice system as well. What was interesting is in that meeting, both Secretaries of State, both for Justice and for Health, made quite a strenuous argument for the idea of having more physical security so that these types of incidents didn't happen in our services. But we already knew in the background that we kind of knew what our secure mental health services needed to look like physically. We'd spent a lot of time thinking about perimeters and airlocks and all of those physical security elements that you'll be accustomed to, particularly if you've worked in prison services. What we were really lacking was a better or an adequate understanding of what this element was called, the third element, which might be relational security. So what we did as a consequence of this cluster of events in 2009, I guess, was to do what we might call a thematic review or a thematic evaluation of incidents and events. But rather than just looking at our medium security services, we looked at a whole spectrum of services, so high security hospitals, medium security, low security, but also events that happened in our community services, in our supported living environments that might be more closely aligned with the services that you're thinking about, but also cases where incidents had happened where somebody was discharged from services and committed an offence or a homicide perhaps in the community. What we did on this occasion was, rather than looking at the event itself, which we so often do, we looked at what happened behind those incidents. So all of those smaller things, perhaps softer things that might have helped lead up to that incident. And we started to map all of those sorts of events from those incidents. And what we did is then kind of map that all into one framework. Historically, what we've been very good at is learning from incidents independently and moving forward, but not necessarily sharing those across the whole of the mental health community. So for us, looking at what was happening in the background of incidents rather than the incident itself was really important. What we tend to find is often incidents and events occur in a very, very physical way. So our tendency is to replace it or follow it up with something physical. But sitting behind that might be 5, 10, 15 or 20 relational elements that actually, had we spotted it, had we understood it properly, we might have been able to prevent that incident happening. Importantly, we also re-looked at the very definition of relational security in our services and rewrote the definition in 2010. In 2015, in our second edition, we edited it slightly again. And in 2023, June this year, we again re-edited our understanding of relational security, based in fact on some work that I was doing with a service in the Netherlands. So our definition now of relational security is that it's what we know and understand about a patient in our services, but also what we know about ourselves. So that component of self-reflection, rather than always looking out at what's happening amongst the people in our services. But not just this linear relationship between us and an individual, but also thinking about what's happening in the wider environment more broadly, perhaps amongst the patient mix, perhaps amongst the staff mix as well. And then thinking about what the possible responses might be and taking that course of action. So that's where See, Think, Act came from as a title for our relational security work, seeing what's happening around us, listening to our patients, thinking about what the right range of possible therapeutic responses might be, and then taking the appropriate therapeutic action to keep that person safe or to keep other people safe as well. So the definition for relational security was a new thing for us, because historically it had always been referred to as this perhaps therapeutic alliance that exists between a clinician and a patient, which was always quite a linear event between two individuals. It's much more holistic than that. Since we've published, the relational security work is now applied in our high security hospitals, but it's also applied in our medium security hospitals, low security services. It's universally used in our acute services across London and wider across our geography. Our psychiatric intensive care units use it, our child and adolescent mental health services use it, supported living and hostels, for example. And gratifyingly, it's been adopted in other countries outside of the UK as well. So I'm aware, although I haven't done any work with China, I'm aware that China have done some work with the See, Think, Act material. I do quite a lot of work with Canada. New Zealand Prison Service have been using it as part of their orientation, Australia, the US, and obviously the Netherlands too. A little bit about our guide to relational security. The See, Think, Act document is what you might call an overarching policy document for relational security. When we wrote it, it was really important from my perspective that we didn't write 3 volumes of work that would be completely inaccessible to most of the people who work in our services. So See, Think, Act is quite a short document, although it seems to be growing the more you add stuff into it. But it's a very easily accessible document for our staff, not just our doctors and psychologists, but most importantly, perhaps for our support workers, those people who spend the most amount of time with the people in our care. It's written in a very digestible way, so it doesn't include absolutely everything. And despite my instincts for using too many words, we've tried to write it in very straightforward language. So it's a very, very accessible document. Sitting outside of that See, Think, Act document, what we've done is produced a load of other supporting resources so that we don't overwhelm people, that they can dive into as and when they need it. So as an example, there are a range of resources that are for organisations that are about adopting the relational security work, investigation tools, supervision tools, reflections, interview questions even, and patient mapping tools. But also staff development tools, so explorers that look at versions for self-reflection and supervision. I'm not going to dive into these in too much detail, but we've developed relational security development workbooks for staff that enable them to not just learn about what relational security is, but to start diving into some of these areas. So if we think about boundaries, for example, rather than just telling people what boundaries is all about, we actually start to think about, well, actually, how does it feel for me? What does boundaries look like in my service? And start to think about developing evaluations or competency frameworks for those individuals. So this is an example of a couple of pages from the boundaries segment, and here are a couple of pages of examples from our personal world segment. We've also developed e-learning this year as well. So we now have e-learning for an introduction to relational security for our staff. And this week we've just launched our Boundaries e-learning program as well. I would never say that e-learning is the answer to training and development of our staff, but what we find here in the UK, particularly now, particularly post-COVID, is that we're struggling to get a lot of our staff out of off the wards and out of services in order to sort of give them those kind of really important training days. So by delivering some e-learning, we are still making sure that our staff have the basic learning that they need, an opportunity for self-reflection, so that when we do have the opportunity to bring them together into a session where we talk about these subjects, they've actually got the basic knowledge they need to be able to contribute to a more meaningful conversation, rather than teaching all the basics and the semantics in those important opportunities. So here is an overview, an impression of what the model of relational security looks like for us in mental health services here in the UK, and for those other organisations more globally who've adopted it. So when we did the thematic review, these are the areas where all of those smaller pieces of signatures or things that led up to incidents tended to land. So we learned almost instantly that it isn't about a relationship between one individual and a patient, perhaps. There's an awful lot more going on in our services that we need to understand. And part of the benefit of putting it together in a single model is that often things are happening away from our original perception of relational security that are actually really important to keeping people safe in services. The other reason I like to put it together as a single model is to be able to help staff understand the specialist nature of what they do. So I meet a lot of staff who are maybe healthcare workers or nursing staff in our services, and if I ask them what they do, they'll say, well, I'm a support worker or I'm a nurse, but they're not able to describe fully the specialist nature of what they do. So there's something about helping people articulate the really unique nature of the work that people do in our mental health services here. I thought I'd just spend a couple of minutes working through each of these areas so I can help you understand a little bit about what all of these different areas mean. But one of the pieces of work that we found quite important to do here is not just to explain what boundaries means and what therapy means, but also more strategically for us to help our organisations understand how relational security fits with the accomplishment of wider organisational goals. Often we see here that, I'm just letting somebody in, often what we find here is that people tend to perceive relational security as something that our ward staff do or our service or unit staff do, and forget that there is a whole strategic component to relational security. If you think back to the workbooks that I just showed you, 50% of the exercises and reflective practice in there are for managers and leaders, not just staff who are directly responsible for patient care. So the team component within the relational security module covers two areas. The first area is boundaries. The data that we have from our e-learning program shows still that most of our staff still believe that the management of boundaries with our service users is still the most important to them, the most relevant to them in their services, but also the biggest challenge, which is why we produce the boundaries e-learning first for people. Our boundaries segment looks at not just how to manage boundaries with service users, but it also looks at the impact of trauma in terms of how people are able to manage boundaries and rules in their services. It looks at, do we even know what the rules are? And do we know what the therapeutic justification is for having them? When we're talking to people about the boundaries and rules in our services, how are we communicating them, and how are we listening to the needs and the values of people in our services? How do we apply consistency with boundaries in a world where we want to reduce blanket restrictions and restrictive practice in our services? The issue of consistency is one that comes up as the biggest issue for staff, in that often they think that they have to be giving the same answer every time to every patient. And of course, it isn't quite as straightforward as that. It's much more nuanced. The therapy section looks at not what therapies work and what therapies don't, but more what's our attitude and approach to therapy. Now, in a justice service, it may not necessarily be about CBT or DBT, although of course it might. The outcomes for therapy might be about independent living, independence, reduced vulnerability, for example. Whatever outcomes we're looking for those individuals, it's important that we understand what that person's perspective is and what their experience is, and ensuring that when we're writing plans of support for those individuals, we have clearly stated outcomes, and we're thinking about what we need to accomplish to help that person move on or progress, rather than always just thinking about containment and support and care. What are the results that we're looking for with that person? If we look at the other patients, so this wider understanding of what relational security is beyond this linear relationship with an individual, we break it into two areas. The first component is patient mix. So patient mix is the second area from our data that our staff are particularly concerned about. What's interesting is that what staff seem to say is that the patient mix feels a real challenge to them in terms of managing it. But when we ask people where they want to most develop their skills and learning, almost nobody says patient mix. And that suggests to us that people think patient mix is a problem, but they think it's somebody else's problem. But one of the things that we know is that whilst we may not be able to change the mix, there are things that we can do in order to respond to the mix and adapt to the mix of people in our services. So the patient mix isn't static. We need to evolve and adapt to fit with it. So you can see some of the things here that can start to get influenced by that, which is activities and therapies programming, our staff training, needs assessment. What we tend to find here is that people talk about the patient mix or the service user mix in very anecdotal terms. They describe it in a single word, whereas what we're starting to do is do much more evaluation about what the mix actually looks like. So we agree what characteristics and factors are relevant for the mix, and then we map all of our service users against it, so we get a visual impression of what the mix actually is, and then start to see the trends. It starts to raise questions for us about risk, vulnerability, other needs that perhaps we haven't met. Patient dynamic starts to look at, once we know what our patient mix is, do we really know what's happening amongst the people in our services? Are we attuned to how they feel, but also how they're functioning around each other? Are we aware of the incidents that could emerge in our services, not just in terms of labeling those incidents, but do we know what the signatures and signals of those incidents are? I'll often find people talk about their anxiety about an incident and they'll label it. So they'll say, I'm worried about an abscond, I'm worried about an escape, I'm worried about self-harm, and then they'll move on. Whereas we need to find space to say, well, actually, do we know what the indicators of somebody self-injuring are? Would we know what to look for if somebody was planning to take their own life, for example? And we find that our staff need that knowledge, and without it, they're unable to get out in front of incidents, and that's how incidents happen. Although we've called this patient dynamic, we found a large space in here also for staff dynamic. There's probably a 50-50 split now in our latest version about not just understanding what's going on between our patients, but also understanding what's going on for us. Often staff are interested in a conversation about staff dynamic, but sometimes they don't remember that what's happening in the staff dynamic has a direct impact on how our service users feel, but also how safe the service is. And that starts to unpack all sorts of issues around culture, safety, how staff talk to each other, professionalism, etc., and so on. It's almost limitless. The fourth component looks at the inside world of the individuals that we're providing support and care for. We've broken this into their personal world and also the physical environment that they experience. The early versions of the personal world segment focus much more on our learning from suicides that had occurred in our services and cases where people had taken their own lives and our staff hadn't seen the signs of that happening, or they had perhaps looked and taken things at face value and not noticed that that patient particularly was projecting themselves in a way purposely designed to have them staff remove their attention from that individual. And there's a very, very strong element of that too remaining in there. but increasingly there's a very much more of a trauma component to this, and also a lot of practical stuff about how we communicate and converse with the people in our care. And I increasingly find people who are new to our services, who have been through all of their training, maybe they've been through their nursing training or the psychology training, and they often come to us and say, actually, I've done all this training, but I still don't know how to talk to somebody. If somebody made a racist comment to me, or if somebody said that they wanted to injure themselves, I don't have the therapeutic narrative to be able to respond to that in a way that is meaningful for that person and therapeutic, and also that I give a good account of myself as well. So there's an increasing emphasis in there about practical knowledge and helping people learn the narrative that you need for these services. In the physical environment, although we obviously said physical security is different to relational security, there are some things you can do in your physical environment that will make things easier or harder for relational security. There are a few components to this. The first is about, well, to what extent might the people in our services use our environments in a harmful way? We need to understand that. But we also need to understand the opportunities our environment presents to provide an environment that is therapeutic and hopeful. Again, like our patient dynamic segment, there's an increasing emphasis here on how do our staff use the environment? How do we engage in that space that makes our service users feel supported and connected? Or are we all hiding in the office? And if we're hiding in the office, why are we hiding in the office? What is it that makes that office a safe space, for example? Why are we removing ourselves from the people in our care? And of course, we know that the more we remove ourselves, the less likely it is that we'll understand the people in our care. The less likely we understand them, the more dangerous they appear. The more dangerous they appear, the more likely we are to remove ourselves. So there's a lot of stuff in there about ward, office, space utilization, and clinical effectiveness as well. And then finally, many of the themes that came up for us in our incident investigations were not just about what was happening in our services and how we're managing relational security with the people in our care. It was also about understanding what's happening outside of our services in terms of visitors, so people coming into our services, and also outward connections. So the connections that the people in our services have externally, whether that's physically going out, geographically leaving our sites through supported leave or escorted leave into the community, or digital connections, virtual connections with people, and how we make sure that stays safe and supported, but also how we make sure that we are using therapeutic opportunities and we are using outward connections to actually help people grow and learn, rather than just seeing it as a privilege, as we so often do in our services. So that's a very, very quick run through the relational security module. I'm very, very happy to answer any questions. I apologize, it's a very, very kind of short summary of the work that we've done here, but I do hope that's useful. Veronique, do you want to take me off being the host and lead so that you can control everybody else's access?
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And on your behalf, no apologies needed, because we planned this short. But thank you for taking this time. Are there any questions? Because I will start with a question. I think when it comes to the prison service, you mentioned the word independence and making people more independent. Is that I feel that when you compare it with the prison service, it's the word independence has a very different meaning, and it's much less elaborated on how to grow, make sure that people become more independent. So what are your reflections on this?
I think I would say that whilst I'm presenting this as something that we've developed here in the UK, I wouldn't by any stretch say that we have this sorted. I would never tell you that all of our services in mental health are doing this and they're doing it well. I think the striving for independence is still something that we have a very, very long journey to do with mental health services. I think it's very easy, maybe more so in prison services, but still so in our secure mental health settings, to put so much rigor around people, so many rules and so many restrictions. We actually limit them. We make people worse, and we create this situation where people have so much regulation around how they live in our services that they feel completely inequipped to be able to go out into the real world again. They don't, we often consider them as safe spaces, but the work of the relational security work should be about creating safe spaces that reflect our communities so that people feel better able and better confident. So we often have people coming into our services who used to shop and cook and clean and do everything for themselves, and they spend 2 or 3 years with us, and then they've lost those skills. So the relational security work has to be about recognizing where people still have skills, maintaining those skills as much as we possibly can, and helping those people who don't have those skills growing them.
Thank you. Helena, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I was wondering, so you made quite clear that training staff in a particular way is really, really important to make this work the way it's supposed to work. I was wondering how much supervision or intervention is needed after training or continuous training, because I can imagine that this is also very demanding for staff members. And you mentioned trauma, and when thinking about suicide attempts or things like that, it can also be traumatizing for staff members. So how would you see that?
I think one of the mistakes that we made historically is that we delivered relational security training to when people first arrived into services. And then it stopped. And maybe they had an annual update, but the annual update was the same presentation they had when they arrived, because it was about auditing and making sure that people were updated. I think the relational security work, there's a space to be, there's a space for talking to people when they first arrive into services, but there's a limit to what they can bring to that conversation because they haven't yet worked in their ward or in their service. I think that this has to be ongoing development with staff. If you look at the model, this is basically what our staff should be doing all the time. This is their job. One of the pieces of advice that I would give, that I've certainly learned myself about relational security training, is do it as a team. So often we see people come to relational security training and they run the day, and lots of people from different services come to that training. I will always deliver relational security training by ward or by service. So it's got your psychiatrist, your psychologist, your occupational therapist, your support workers, and they all come together. So they talk about their service users, they talk about their boundaries, and they continue to learn together. And it is far better, it's far more likely that people will commit to change if they've done that as part of their peer group, rather than attending a random training course that they've been on. So this has to be continuous development, which is why, yes, we have some e-learning and initial induction training programs, but most of the work around relational security that we've developed is about continuous progress, reflection, supervision, continued learning, and assessing and evaluating our skills and thinking. That can be the only way of delivering this well, I think.